Hello, friends and neighbors, welcome in the light, where laughter's the answer and hearts are shining bright, with calloused hands and wits, so raise your sharp. Let's praise a place where love ignites the spark.
Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to Sunnyside. It's been a rainy week since we visited last, and that hasn't been much help in putting up that hay I've been whining about. But in this last week, I've had the opportunity to improve my mechanical skills and gain some footholds on that midlife ag degree I've been working on. I had the chance to get that broken hay rake repaired, and with the help of my dad, one more time, we got it put together, which wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. But that's probably more to do with his experience than my own. And I couldn't wait to test it out on the hayfield, now 2 weeks overgrown from the last cutting. So out I went, smiling like the cat that ate the proverbial canary. And I had a marvelous time turning over that hay for about 2 rounds. And then it broke again. It broke exactly where it should have. The part I put together myself, the universal joint that I had ordered in separate parts and had had a dandy of a time getting together. Who needs those last 2 snap rings anyway, I ask myself? Well, it turns out you do need those snap rings, and if you order the universal joint already assembled, you don't have to go through the pain and frustration of doing it yourself. That's what my dad had recommended, and so I wait now for that part to arrive, assembled and ready to put on, hopefully just one last time. I ran into some loyal listeners, by the way, at the gas station. Jim Benson asked me how my hay was coming along. Well, now you know, Jim. But I also had the chance to load up some old equipment between the farms and send them off to auction, pulling out all that equipment last week to get to the other rake, which, by the way, is still out of commission, inspired my dad and I to part with some things we no longer needed. My son Jack and I spent time together removing the old aftermarket Sherburne cab on the 4020, and even my brother Justin stopped over to help. That went on the trailer for auction, the cab, not the 4020. My dad and I loaded his old sickle mower. He had cleaned it up and even taped down the original owner's manual. Then we loaded up an old heavy-duty 3-point snowblower that came with the 4020 when we got it many years ago. It was a heavy son of a gun, I can tell you that, but we got it chained down on the trailer anyway. And finally, we loaded the old bale accumulator that had come with the baler I bought at auction a few years ago. Both it and the snowblower had been occupying space in our yard here at Sunnyside for quite a while. And Heidi had had enough. So off they went to auction in Blue Earth to be sold later this week. And I hope they bring a price worth the time it took to clean, load, and deliver them. And I wish whoever the new owners are well. Now, those old pieces of equipment had been occupying our farmstead for far too long. I had ignored and put off getting rid of them, but the time came to finally part ways. And it got me to thinking about occupations. Not the career type of occupations, but the kind that sit right there in your living room or in your car or in your pocket day in and day out. And I started to wonder whether there was a correlation between those old redcoats from the Revolution and some of the things that I have been quartering or that have been quartering themselves in our current situation. And guess what? Well, I believe there is a correlation.
Sit still. I said, I can't. Something's tickling me. She thought I was crazy. She said, well, open your coat. I unbuttoned my coat and opened it up. There was a mouse.
Stories. Everybody has them. The stories of our parents, grandparents, and our friends remind us who they are.
That's kind of what I think it is, too, is memories. Growing up, my dad was an English teacher.
How they got here and what they've learned on the way. What if you could collect as many of your loved ones' stories in a high-quality audio format to keep forever? What if you could share the sound of your loved one's voice, their laughter, and their thoughtful manner with your children, or when you are simply driving to work?
He spent literally 3 months in North Dakota freezing buckets of ice water to make this awesome ice fort that we never spent time in, but it was amazing for the moment it was done.
Well, you can with a Sunnyside of Life biography. Produced here at Sunnyside Farm Studios. I'll sit down with your loved one for 1, 2, or several sessions to record their stories.
I think my students are going to have good memories of me.
You'll receive the full raw recording, an edited selection arranged in audio chapters for easy reference, and produced segments you can use for family gatherings, special moments, or any time you just want to hear your loved one's voice.
And those are probably my most cherished things.
Share it with your family and make it a keepsake, because that's what stories are, keepsakes of the time we had together.
Never forget that. I was petrified of mice after that forever.
Email your query for more information to Troy at sunnysidefarmstudios.com. The email is also in this show's notes. Let me record your loved one's story so you can share the sunny side of their life in their own words for years to come.
I actually do kind of remember that now.
In 1765, Great Britain found herself with a massive empire and a whole mountain of debt. The French and Indian War was won, but thousands of red-coated soldiers remained in the American colonies. The British Parliament faced a problem: where to put them. Their solution was the Quartering Act. Public housing first. Colonists had to provide barracks. Inns and taverns next. If barracks filled up, local businesses were seized. Outbuildings and stables, uninhabited houses, and barns were taken. And the ultimate costs? Well, colonists paid for the soldiers' firewood, bedding, and beer. Now, to the British, it was simple logistics. To the colonists, it was an invading army living on their dime. New York outright refused to comply. Parliament responded by suspending their entire assembly. Then came 1774. The Boston Tea Party had turned the harbor into a teapot, and a furious King George signed the Second Quartering Act. This time, the law went further. It allowed royal governors to quarter troops inside inhabited private homes if necessary. Imagine sitting down for supper with your family, only to have a foreign soldier slide into the bench next to your daughter. He ate your food. He burned your wood. He answered to a king 3,000 miles away. Not to you. The anger didn't just simmer, it boiled. It became the Third Amendment to our Constitution. It is the only amendment born purely out of the outrage of having an uninvited guest at the dinner table. But here is the twist history books so often skip. The British generals didn't actually want their men in private homes. They knew a soldier isolated in a colonist's house was a soldier who could be poisoned, stabbed in his sleep, or convinced to desert. General Thomas Gage begged for proper barracks. He knew the policy was a spark next to a powder keg. The law wasn't designed to oppression-proof the colonies. It was a desperate, broke government trying to pass the bill on to the taxpayers. But it backfired. That single act of forced hospitality unified 13 divided colonies faster than any pamphlet ever could. It turned peaceful shopkeepers into furious rebels. They didn't just lock their doors. They built a nation to keep the tyrants out. It was a crisp autumn morning when the British regulars marched into Boston, drums beating, bayonets gleaming. To the king, they were keepers of the peace. But to the colonists, they were a legal nightmare. The American colonists didn't just hate the soldiers because they ate their food or slept in their barns. They hated them because of a concept deeply rooted in British law itself, a concept older than the colonies. It was the ancient legal maxim: a man's house is his castle. Under English common law, even the king could not enter a subject's home without permission. Colonists argued that forcing them to provide firewood, candles, and vinegar was a hidden, unconstitutional tax. The Magna Carta stated taxation required representation, yet Parliament passed these acts without a single colonial vote. The colonists weren't arguing for a new law. They were demanding their birthright as Englishmen. Meet John Adams. Before he was president, he was a brilliant legal mind in Boston. He watched as Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson used the Quartering Act to bypass local magistrates. You see, the law stated that local civil authorities, the town selectmen, were supposed to find the quarters, but when the selectmen conveniently couldn't find any room, well, the British military just took what they wanted anyway. Adams argued this violated the English Bill of Rights of 1689. That sacred document explicitly forbade the king from keeping a standing army among the people during a time of peace without the consent of Parliament. And here was the legal loophole that the colonists seized upon. Their own colonial assemblies were their parliaments. If the Massachusetts Assembly didn't vote for the troops, then legally those troops were an illegal occupying force. But here is the legal knot that history took a century to untangle. The colonists' brilliant legal defense actually put them in a dangerous catch-22. By arguing that they possessed the exact same constitutional rights as citizens living in London, they were inadvertently acknowledging that they were bound by the British system. Parliament saw this and used it against them. Parliament's counter-argument was simple. If you are British subjects, we have the sovereign right to place our army wherever the empire needs defense. By trying to win the argument using British law, the colonists realized the system was rigged against them. The king's judges would always rule for the king. So, John Adams and his compatriots did something radical. They stopped pointing to the English Bill of Rights. They stopped quoting the Magna Carta. They looked to a higher court. They began arguing based on natural law, rights given by God, not by a king. The legal battle over a soldier's bunkmate forced the colonies to realize, well, they couldn't just reform British rule, they had to break it. When we think of colonial rebellion, our minds wander straight to the cobblestone streets of Boston or the defiant assembly halls of New York, but history has a way of focusing on the loudest voices while whispering the stories of the others. While Massachusetts was shouting from the rooftops and New York was actively getting its assembly suspended for saying no, the other colonies were watching. They knew they couldn't just throw punches. They had to outsmart the British legal machine. Take Pennsylvania. The law from London stated that the provincial government had to pay to supply the king's troops with vinegar, salt, and beer. The clever lawyers in Philadelphia looked at the wording of the Quartering Act, and they didn't stage a riot. Instead, the Pennsylvania Assembly passed their own statute. They wrote in beautiful, dense legalese that the people of Pennsylvania possessed the exact same constitutional right not to be burdened with the sojourning of soldiers against their will. Pennsylvania law deliberately sacrificed public houses and inns, filling them to the brim to legally declare that no private domiciles could be touched. They claimed they were perfectly willing to follow the law, but only under the exact terms of the English Mutiny Act, which legally barred troops from private homes. They didn't break the law. They used British law as a shield to choke out the Army's demands. Down in South Carolina, they played a different game of constitutional chess. When British troops arrived in Charleston, the royal governor demanded the colony build barracks and provide provisions. The South Carolina Commons House of Assembly didn't refuse. That would be treason. Instead, they used the power of the purse. The Assembly simply delayed voting on the tax appropriations needed to buy the soldiers beef and firewood. Weeks turned into months. They argued over minutiae, debated procedural rules, and questioned the exact inventory of the requested blankets. When the British generals complained, the Carolinians smiled politely and said they were working on it. But the wheels of government, they do turn slowly. They effectively starved the redcoats out of their supplies through pure, unadulterated, bureaucratic foot-dragging. But there's one more piece to this continental puzzle, a legal maneuver from New Jersey that drove the British High Command absolutely mad. In 1766, New Jersey was told they had to supply 2 imperial regiments. The New Jersey Assembly looked at the Quartering Act. They noticed the law required them to provide specific items: barracks, bedding, utensils, firewood, candles, and, of course, liquor. So, New Jersey passed an act providing for the barracks and the bedding. They even threw in the firewood. But they explicitly omitted the meat, the salt, and the vinegar. I don't know what they did about the liquor. When General Thomas Gage furiously demanded to know why his soldiers were eating bland food without vinegar, New Jersey's legislators calmly replied that their colony's constitutional authority allowed them to interpret how to allocate their own taxpayers' money. If Parliament wanted vinegar, Parliament could sail across the Atlantic and bring it themselves. By the time the First Continental Congress met in 1774, this piecemeal resistance became a unified front. The delegates didn't just protest Boston's plight, they issued the Declaration of Resolves, stating that keeping a standing army in any colony without the consent of that specific colony's legislature was completely illegal. Boston provided the fire, but it was the legal stubbornness of Pennsylvania, the pocketbook delays of South Carolina, and the vinegar-less compliance of New Jersey that proved the resistance wasn't a local riot, it was a continent deciding it had outgrown its chains. Let's return for a minute to General Gage. He was a man caught between a stubborn king and an even more stubborn continent. He was a professional soldier, a husband to an American-born wife, and the commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America. General Thomas Gage did not want a war. He wanted order. But by 1766, his desk in New York was piled high with letters from every corner of the colonies, and every single one of them was a headache. Parliament, 3,000 miles away, thought they had handed Gage a beautiful tool with the Quartering Act. In reality, they had handed him a live grenade. Gage was a pragmatist. He knew the rules of war, but he was completely outmatched by the rules of colonial bureaucracy. Right outside his headquarters, the New York Assembly flatly refused to provide vinegar and salt. Gage had to watch his own troops grow sullen and sick, while politicians argued over a grocery list. When he sent regiments to Boston to enforce the peace, the town selectmen looked him in the eye and told him the barracks on Castle Island, miles out in the harbor, were technically empty, so he couldn't legally touch a single building in the city proper. Because the colonies refused to pay for the troops' upkeep, Gage was forced to dip into the imperial treasury, running up massive bills that made the bean counters in London furious. Gage wrote letter after letter to his superiors in England, begging them to understand. He told them the law was unenforceable. He warned them that forcing soldiers into the daily lives of colonists was like dragging a burning torch through a powder mill. But London wouldn't listen. They told him to stand firm. As the crisis deepened, Gage's headache became deeply personal. You see, Thomas Gage was married to Margaret Kemble. She was a beautiful, intelligent woman from a prominent New Jersey family. Her cousins and friends were the very colonists legally resisting her husband's army. Imagine the dinner table at the Gage household. The general would spend his day fighting with the New Jersey Assembly over their refusal to supply meat and vinegar to his men. Then he would come home to a wife whose heart belonged to the very soil he was ordered to subdue. History nighthawks have long whispered that Margaret was more than just an observer. Years later, when the first shots were fired, it was rumored that Gage's most sensitive military secrets were leaking directly to the Patriots. The general was fighting a war against an invisible legal web abroad and quite possibly a quiet rebellion under his own roof. But here is the final tragic turn for General Thomas Gage. In 1774, frustrated by years of legal foot-dragging, Parliament passed the Second Quartering Act, giving Gage the absolute power to governor appoint troops into buildings and homes. They thought they had finally given their general the teeth he needed to crush the resistance. Gage knew better. He knew that using his new power would be the point of no return. When he finally marched his men into Boston to enforce the coercive acts, he didn't use the law to forcefully shove redcoats into private bedrooms at all. He knew it would trigger an immediate bloodbath. Instead, he spent thousands of pounds renting empty stores, warehouses, and pitching tents on the freezing mud of the Boston Common. The king wanted him to be a tyrant, but Gage tried to the very end to be a gentleman and a legalist. He tried to build a wall of tents to keep his soldiers and the angry citizens apart. But you cannot stop history with canvas. On April 19, 1775, the legal arguments finally fell silent. The bureaucratic foot-dragging ended. A column of Gage's redcoats marched out toward Lexington and Concord to seize colonial gunpowder, and the spark he had spent a decade trying to avoid finally hit the powder keg. Thomas Gage was recalled to England in disgrace just months later, blamed by the king for being too soft, and blamed by the Americans for being a despot. He died a fairly forgotten man, broken by a multi-colony headache that no army could ever cure.
Hi, this is Scott Bertelson. I was a public education instructor at Forest City High School for 39/40 Hooks Counting years. And during that time, I learned a lot about myself and life, as I still am now in my retirement. That's why I am hosting Mr. B's Dinner Party on this podcast platform. And I hope that you will join me at the dinner table for conversational morsels for the mind. Now, you may be wondering what that is. Well, you'll have to tune in to find out. But let me guarantee you, you will leave my dinner table feeling full and feeling satisfied.
Join Mr. B's Dinner Party from Sunnyside Farm Studios every other Wednesday.
Hope that you will join me for Mr. B's Dinner Party on this platform.
And so we return to that Third Amendment. It is the shortest of the heavyweights. Just 32 words long, in fact. Most Americans can recite the First Amendment, and millions will debate the Second. But the Third? It sits in the shadows of our Bill of Rights, rarely recited, and almost never litigated. When the Founding Fathers gathered in 1789 to draft the guardrails of a new republic, they carried the fresh bruises of British occupation. They remembered the empty pockets of New York, the empty vinegar jars of New Jersey, and the tents pitched on the freezing mud of the Boston Common. They sat down to fix General Thomas Gage's nightmare once and for all. James Madison took up his pen and crafted a masterpiece of legal precision. It reads, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." Look closely at how those 32 words systematically dismantled every trick the British Empire ever tried to pull. In peacetime, the government's power stops at your front door. No loopholes, no exceptions. A soldier cannot enter unless you say yes. The king can no longer bypass the homeowner. Even if the nation is at war, the military cannot just seize your property on a whim. Only a civilian legislature elected by the people can write the rules for how it's done. Madison didn't just write a law. He built a fortress around the American home. Because the Third Amendment is so rarely brought before the Supreme Court, some legal scholars have called it a dead amendment. But they miss the entire point of its design. The Third Amendment isn't dead. It is just perfectly successful. You see, General Gage's great nightmare was the blurring of the line between the citizen and the soldier. When a government forces the military into the civilian sanctuary, the military stops being the protector and becomes the occupier. By locking the door against forced quartering, the founders ensured that the United States military would always remain subordinate to civilian authority. The Army could never become a domestic police force living off the fat of the land. It is the only amendment that has never been violated on a mass scale in American history. It did its job so well that we took the peace it provided for granted. But there is a modern chapter to this 18th century law, a moment when James Madison's 32 words reached across 2 centuries to protect a new generation of Americans. In 1982, inside the prison walls of New York State, correctional officers went on strike. To keep the prison running, the governor called in the National Guard. But the state needed a place to house these guardsmen. So, without asking permission, prison executives evicted the striking correctional officers from their state-owned employee housing and moved the National Guard troops right into their beds. The officers sued, and the case, Engblom versus Carey, went before a federal appeals court. The state argued that the Third Amendment didn't apply because they claimed the buildings were state property and prison guards weren't really soldiers. But the court looked back to the principles born out of the American Revolution. They ruled that a National Guardsman is a soldier under the law and a rented apartment is a man's castle. For the first time in history, a court explicitly used the Third Amendment to strike down a government action, proving that the ancient grievance of 1774 was still alive and kicking, even in the 20th century. The British thought they could solve a budget crisis by treating the colonists' homes as free hotels. Instead, they triggered a revolution. Today, we sleep safely in our beds, never worrying about a foreign boot on the stairs or an uninvited guest at the supper table, not because the military grew kinder, but because 32 words slammed the door on tyranny and bolted it shut forever. But our modern chapter didn't end the book in 1982. Those proverbial redcoats are still seeking quarter in our homes today. It's a shiny piece of glass and aluminum. It sits in your pocket, rests on your nightstand, and listens for your voice to play your favorite song. You think of it as a convenience, but a new generation of legal scholars look at the glowing screen and they see a modern-day redcoat. When James Madison put pen to paper in 1789, a man's home was bounded by 4 wooden walls, a heavy timber door, and an iron deadbolt. Tyranny had to wear muddy boots and knock on the door to get inside. But we don't live in Madison's world anymore. Today, the government doesn't need to quarter a flesh and blood soldier in your guest bedroom to watch what you do. Instead, the modern state just uses data. They use algorithms. They use the digital infrastructure built right into the marrow of your home. Microphones in your kitchen. Cameras on your doorbell, and smart thermostats that track when you sleep and when you wake. Tech companies collect this data, and under current laws, the government can often buy or subpoena it without a traditional search warrant. Your home is no longer a sanctuary. It is a data-generating sieve. Legal trailblazers are looking at this digital landscape and asking a radical question. Is data surveillance just a high-tech of quartering? A high-tech form of quartering? Now, welcome in the legal theorists who are dusting off the Third Amendment once again for the Internet age. For generations, judges used the Fourth Amendment, the protection against unreasonable searches, to fight surveillance. But as technology outpaces the law, the Fourth Amendment is kind of wearing thin. So scholars are pointing back to those 32 words that Madison wrote. They argued that the Third Amendment isn't just about soldiers, it is about the right to domestic privacy and civilian autonomy. When the British Army quartered themselves in colonial homes, they didn't just take up physical space, they took up psychological space. They monitored conversations. They controlled the environment. They forced the homeowner to bear the financial and emotional cost of their occupation. Today, when the state uses corporate tech infrastructure to plant virtual eyes and ears inside your living room, well, they're doing the exact same thing. They are occupying your private sanctuary without your consent. By interpreting soldier as a metaphor for state surveillance tools and quartering as the forced hosting of government spyware or data collection on your private devices, the Third Amendment suddenly wakes up from a 200-year nap. But here's the cable that connects the legal battles of 1774 directly to the courtroom battles of our 21st century. The British government always claimed their quartering acts were for the colonists' own protection. They said the soldiers were there to defend them from foreign enemies and keep the peace. Sound familiar? Today, the surveillance state uses the exact same sales pitch. They tell us the tracking, the data mining, and the digital eyes are there to protect us from terrorists, scammers, and criminals. But, just like the stubborn lawyers of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, modern privacy advocates are refusing to buy the argument. They're arguing that when the government uses your internet router, your smart speaker, or your smartphone to keep tabs on you, they are forcing you to pay the electricity bill and the data costs for your own surveillance. They are making you fund the digital redcoat standing right there in your kitchen. We used to think the Third Amendment was a relic of a dead era, an obsolete rule about old muskets and rented barns. But Madison's 32 words weren't built for a century. They were built for a principle. The battlefield has changed from the cobblestones of Boston to the silicon chips of Silicon Valley. But the question remains exactly the same. Who rules your castle? Let's travel back to an America, say, in the mid-1960s for a moment. It was hot in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1965, and inside the marble walls of the Supreme Court, 9 men in black robes were debating a law from Connecticut, a law that made it a crime for anyone, even married couples, to use birth control. Most people saw it as a case about medicine or morals, but one justice looked at it and smelled the musty wool of a British redcoat. The justice was William O. Douglas. He was an outdoorsman, a fiercely independent thinker, and a man who deeply mistrusted government intrusion. Douglas had a problem. He knew the Connecticut law was an outrageous violation of personal liberty, but he couldn't find the exact word privacy written anywhere in the Constitution. So he did something that would change American legal history forever. He wrote the majority opinion in the landmark case Griswold versus Connecticut. Douglas argued that the specific guarantees in the Bill of Rights have penumbras. Those are shadowy edges or zones formed by emanations from those very laws. And right there, alongside the First and Fourth Amendments, Douglas shined a spotlight on the long-forgotten Third Amendment. Douglas argued that by forbidding the king from putting a soldier in your house, the Third Amendment was explicitly creating a zone of privacy for the home. If the government couldn't force a soldier across your threshold, Douglas reasoned it certainly had no business sending a police officer into a married couple's bedroom to check their nightstand. He took General Gage's old quartering headache and used it as a legal crowbar to open the door for modern privacy rights. But William O. Douglas wasn't the only one gazing into the shadows of the Third Amendment. Sitting nearby was Justice Arthur Goldberg. Goldberg agreed with Douglas, but he took it a step further. He looked at the Third Amendment and argued that it was living proof of the Ninth Amendment, which says just because a right isn't explicitly listed in the Constitution doesn't mean the people don't have it. Goldberg saw the Third Amendment as a clear example of a fundamental right to be left alone by the state. Even Justice John Marshall Harlan II, a conservative institutionalist, joined the chorus. While he preferred to use the Due Process Clause, he pointed to the Third Amendment as a historical pillar of American liberty, a concrete signpost showing that the founders intended the home to be an absolute sanctuary from government meddling. Together, this unlikely coalition of justices used 32 words about 18th century soldier barracks to build the entire constitutional framework for our modern personal privacy, a framework that later protected everything from, well, reproductive choices to who you choose to love in the privacy of your own home, good, bad, or indifferent. And here is the rocket that brings us right into the 21st century. For decades, critics laughed at the Griswold decision. They mocked Justice Douglas's poetic talk about penumbras and emanations. They said that the Third Amendment was just a historical dead end, an obsolete rule about muskets and rented barns that had no business being applied to modern life. But if you fast forward to recent years, when the Supreme Court has had to grapple with the terrifying power of the digital age, specifically the rise of geofence warrants, you might see things differently. This is the technology where law enforcement can force companies like Google or Apple to hand over the location history of every single smartphone in a specific area at a specific time. In a sweeping landmark ruling, the Supreme Court restricted geofence warrants, declaring that the government does violate your constitutional rights when it sweeps up your digital footprint without a strict, individualized warrant. Writing for the majority, Justice Elena Kagan noted that while the database of physical location information is brand new, the principle covering it, well, it's as old as our history. And what is that principle? Privacy advocates and legal scholars are shouting it from the rooftops. It's the exact same principle William O. Douglas pulled out of the Third Amendment back in 1965. When tech companies track your location, they map out the intimate details of your daily life, whether you visited a church, a psychiatrist, or a political rally. If the government can simply seize that data from a server, they are effectively occupying the virtual space of your life. The digital redcoat doesn't need to put his muddy boots on your stairs anymore. He just needs to track the phone, already in your pocket. And that is why modern jurists are looking back at those 32 forgotten words. They're realizing that Madison didn't just write a rule about soldiers. He wrote a timeless commandment. The state must stop at the boundary of your private life. Think about it. You leave your driveway on a Tuesday morning, heading out to buy groceries or pick up the kids or visit a friend. You think you are completely alone in your thoughts. But as you pass the entrance to your neighborhood, a small, unassuming black box attached to a utility pole silently clicks. It doesn't just see your car, it memorizes it. The device is called a flock safety camera. Right now, there are more than 120,000 of them quietly watching the roads of America. They use artificial intelligence to read license plates, identify the color of your car, and catalog the exact minute you leave and the exact minute you return. The company and local police departments call it a masterpiece of modern crime fighting. Well, they say it helps track stolen cars and find missing children. But to a growing band of legal scholars, civil rights activists, and just ordinary citizens, these cameras are the modern equivalent of a redcoat, standing at the edge of your property, clipboard in hand, logging your every move. Unlike a human police officer who must have a reason to pull you over, these cameras automatically track everyone every single day without a warrant. They aren't just on major highways. They are being installed at the entrances of suburban subdivisions and cul-de-sacs, the very perimeter of the American home. A recent investigation revealed dozens of instances where law enforcement officers improperly accessed the network to stalk ex-partners or track personal relationships. It is a technological dragnet that has ignited a fierce, decentralized backlash across the country. Now you might wonder, what does a high-tech camera system have to do with James Madison and the Third Amendment? Well, let's go back to 1774. The British didn't just want to sleep in colonial beds. They wanted to control the perimeter and the situation. By quartering soldiers in taverns, stables, and empty buildings at the crossroads of colonial towns, the British military created a physical wall of surveillance. They knew who was coming, who was going, and who was talking to whom. That is exactly why Madison wrote those 32 words. He wasn't just protecting the mattress in the bedroom. He was protecting the sanctuary of the home from being occupied by the hostile eyes of the state. Today, federal courts are wrestling with whether a network of cameras capturing a citizen's travel snapshots over time violates the Constitution. Cities like Norfolk, Virginia have seen legal challenges arguing that tracking a person's daily routine alters the very nature of what we call privacy. If the government can station an artificial intelligence sentry right outside your neighborhood to log when you go to church, or when you see a doctor, or when you come home late, you have effectively quartered a permanent digital spy on your street corner. They have bypassed your front gate without ever even knocking on your door. And here is the looking glass that shows the spirit of the American Revolution is still very much alive and kicking. When the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, the colonists didn't just sit back and take it. No, they used local assemblies to choke off funding and reject the Crown's overreach. And by golly, history is repeating itself. Over 50 U.S. cities have recently voted to cancel, reject, or completely deactivate their contracts with flock safety due to intense public backlash over mass surveillance. In places like Dayton, Ohio, city workers actually covered the cameras with black trash bags after reviews uncovered egregious policy violations. In other towns, frustrated citizens aren't waiting for city councils at all. No, they're taking a page from the old Sons of Liberty, physically cutting down and smashing the cameras shortly after they are installed. And just days ago, the Supreme Court issued a major 6-3 ruling in Chattree versus the United States, declaring that the government violates constitutional rights when it uses broad digital geofence warrants to sweep up the location data of everyday citizens like you and me. Justice Neil Gorsuch heavily emphasized that your digital location records constitute, well, your own personal property. The message from the High Court is clear. The principles that protected a colonial barn are the exact same principles that must protect a modern server. The battle lines haven't changed since the day of Thomas Gage. The state will always argue that a little less privacy means a lot more safety for you. But as the black boxes click on the street corners across America, citizens are looking back to the Bill of Rights and remembering that a man's castle isn't just his house. It is the right to step out onto a public road without the king's shadow following him home. But we're not quite finished yet. What about that carriage of yours? You turn the key, or maybe now you just push a button. The engine purrs to life, or rattles. For over a century, that sound has been the ultimate anthem of American freedom. It meant you could go anywhere, see anyone, and leave your worries behind in a cloud of exhaust. Your car was your mechanical horse, your mobile sanctuary, your ticket to the open road. But Congress has been quiet at work on a plan that could turn your dashboard into a digital prison cell. It started quietly, buried deep within the hundreds of pages of the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, tucked away in Section 24220. There was a federal mandate ordering the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to require advanced passive technology in all new passenger vehicles. The stated goal was noble, to eliminate drunk driving. But the language Congress chose opened up a legal Pandora's box. The law demands that your future vehicle must constantly, passively monitor your performance and behavior. And if a silent algorithm decides you are impaired or simply driving in a way that the software doesn't like, the vehicle must automatically prevent or limit its own operation. Critics call it what it is: a government-mandated vehicle kill switch. If you swerve to avoid a pothole or a deer, the car's cameras and sensors could flag you as unfit and shut down your engine on a dark and dangerous highway. The law contains no mechanism to appeal the machine's decision, no human override, and no day in court before your property is locked down. In Washington, representatives like, well, my favorite guy, Thomas Massey, and John James have aggressively pushed legislation like the No Kill Switches in Cars Act to defund and repeal the mandate. Yet, the bureaucratic gears keep turning toward mandatory implementation. Now, you might ask what a high-tech car sensor has to do with an 18th century British soldier. Well, let's go back to Madison's 32 words in the Third Amendment. The underlying principle wasn't just about keeping redcoats out of your guest room. It was about preventing the state from conscripting your private property to serve as an instrument of its own authority. When the British forced colonists to house soldiers, they were turning private sanctuaries into miniature military outposts. When Congress mandates that automakers install cameras, biometric sensors, and shut down software into your private vehicle, well, they are doing the exact same thing. They are forcing you to buy, maintain, and house a permanent government inspector inside your second largest financial investment. Your car is no longer just your property. It has been legally quartered by the state to monitor your blinking eyes, log your location, and report your driving habits. The redcoat isn't standing on your stairs anymore. He's sitting right there in the passenger seat, his digital hand hovering over your steering wheel. But here is an unsettling feature of this high-tech overreach. Automakers didn't wait for the government to force their hand. They realized that a car packed with monitoring sensors is a gold mine. For the past few years, major car companies have quietly been collecting their drivers' acceleration, braking, and location data, and guess what? Selling it directly to insurance companies, causing premiums to skyrocket for everyday Americans who had no idea they were being spied on. The corporate surveillance network was already built. Congress simply stepped in to weaponize it with a kill switch. Yet, the fight is reaching a fever pitch as the automotive industry pushes toward a future where a computer chip can revoke your right to travel at the whim of an algorithm. The American people are pushing back. Just as the early colonists used local assemblies to starve out General Gage's army, modern lawmakers are attempting to withhold the federal funds needed to finalize these Orwellian regulations, and let's hope that they're successful. The founders knew that true liberty requires a boundary line the government just cannot cross. They drew that line at the front door of your home. But as you turn the key on tomorrow's highway, you may soon find that the door to your castle has wheels. But the king has taken the keys. Hello, friends and neighbors. Welcome to the Sunnyside of Life Bible in a Year experience. Join me each day as I read the Bible from start to finish. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. These are the instructions for the guilt offering. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully keep all his commands that I am giving you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the world. Do you really think these men are coming here to honor your father? No. Fire flashed down from heaven and burned up the burnt offerings and sacrifices. Listen to me, you who have understanding. Everyone knows that God doesn't sin. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. He tore his clothes and put on burlap and went into the temple of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to Israel. How long, O Lord, must I call for help? The Word was with God, and the Word was God. But by Jesus Christ himself and by God the Father, who raised Jesus from the dead, he who is the faithful witness to all these things says, yes, I am coming soon. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. May the grace of the Lord Jesus be with God's holy people. Its own podcast, January 1st through December 31st. Every year, the Sunnyside of Life Bible in a Year experience. For free from Sunnyside Farm Studios. I pray this daily reading will bless you as much as it does me. So let's get started. But there is another form or law in our world. There is another tome that defines right and wrong for every human being. It is a book studied by billions, hopefully, filled with ancient wisdom, definitely, poetry, and prophecy. But if you open it with the eyes of a constitutional lawyer, well, you'll find that the battles we're fighting today over privacy, overreach, and the surveillance state, well, they were anticipated thousands of years ago. When James Madison drafted that Third Amendment, he famously settled on a precise, compact structure of exactly 32 words. He wanted to make sure that the home remained an absolute sanctuary, completely locked down against uninvited state intruders. But long before the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the concept of protecting the home from an aggressive, unexpected breach was laid out in the Scriptures. Look at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verse 39. In the King James Version, it's a verse that mirrors James Madison's masterpiece with uncanny precision. And guess what? It, too, is exactly 32 words long. It reads, "And this know, that if the good man of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not have suffered his house to be broken through. Consider the weight of those 32 words in our modern debate over flock cameras and the automated vehicle surveillance. The verse warns of a thief who comes at an unknown hour. Today's mass surveillance systems don't announce themselves. They quietly slip into your daily life while you sleep. If the homeowner had known, he would have watched. The greatest danger of the modern surveillance state is that it relies on your ignorance. It operates silently in the background of your neighborhood and your dashboard. The verse concludes that the tragedy of a house being broken through. When a government uses digital eyes to peer past your property lines, your architectural sanctuary has been structurally compromised. And there's another verse, about half as long, that speaks directly to the modern technology Congress and corporate giants are using to monitor your private travel. You can turn your Bible to the book of Proverbs, chapter 27, verse 12. In the classic King James text, it stands as another warning. A prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. Think about that ancient proverb in the context of the modern open road. For generations, an American could hide himself simply by driving away. If you needed to clear your head, or escape a stressful situation, or find a moment of peace, you got behind the wheel and let the highway swallow you up, let alone help to put those little kids to sleep when they wouldn't go to sleep. They're little babies. Something about a car ride. Guns N' Roses helped do that. But today, under the watchful gaze of AI license plate readers and mandated vehicle kill switches, the ability to hide yourself to maintain a baseline of anonymous, peaceful civilian movement, it's being systematically dismantled. The simple pass on, they accept the tracking boxes on the utility poles, they nod along with the corporate terms of the service, and they ignore the fine print in the congressional infrastructure bills. Of course. And only later, when their insurance premiums double or their engine suddenly shuts off on a dark highway, that's when they realize they are punished. And here's the remarkable parallel, I think, between the 32 words of the Third Amendment and the 32 words of the Gospel of Luke. In the biblical narrative, the good man of the house is caught off guard because he assumed his house was naturally secure. He trusted the heavy wood of his door and the quiet of the night. He didn't think he needed to be actively vigilant. That was the exact same mistake the American colonists made before General Thomas Gage arrived with his regiments. They thought the Atlantic Ocean and their traditional English rights were enough to keep them safe. They didn't realize that tyranny doesn't care about traditions. It cares about control. Of course, that verse is Jesus' way of letting us know that we need to be ready all the time. Today, we're making the same mistake, though. We assume that because our physical front doors are locked, that our castles are secure. But we're not really ready. We forget that the modern thief doesn't need to break your window to break through your house. He just needs an internet connection, a roadside camera network, and a mandatory sensor on your dashboard. The ancient scriptures and the Bill of Rights are shouting the exact same warning across the centuries. True security requires active, tireless vigilance. You got to be ready. If you don't watch the perimeter, you will wake up to find that your sanctuary has already been conquered from within. When we look back at the furious debates of the American Revolution, we tend to see them in black and white, a history of tax stamps, muskets, and legal broadsides. We look at the Third Amendment and think James Madison was merely settling an old score with General Thomas Gage over a bunch of uninvited British soldiers. But we miss the grander architecture of what the founders were actually trying to build. They didn't design the Bill of Rights just to give lawyers something to argue about in a courtroom now and then. They built those protections because they knew that true human happiness cannot grow in soil that is constantly being trampled by the state. They locked the door against the redcoat and, by extension, the digital spy, the roadside tracker, and the dashboard kill switch, and many things more, perhaps, for a much higher purpose. They wanted to guarantee that when a hard-working citizen came home, blew out the candle, so to speak, and sat by the hearth, the outside world could not force its way in. Your home was meant to be a sanctuary of pure, unpolluted liberty, a place where your thoughts, your conversations, and your family life belonged exclusively to you. By banishing the shadow of government intrusion, they ensured that the American home would be a cradle of rest, not a breeding ground for anxiety. You see, a man's house isn't a castle because it has a moat or stone battlements. It is a castle because within those walls, he is sovereign. Madison knew that if a citizen had to constantly worry about a government inspector monitoring their living room or tracking their carriage down a country road or reporting on their family dinner, the human spirit would slowly begin to wither. Fear would replace freedom. Suspicion would replace security. The Third Amendment wasn't written out of hatred for the British Army. I mean, maybe a little bit. It was written, though, out of a profound, enduring love for the ordinary, peaceful moments of human existence. It was designed to give Americans the constitutional right to pursue and enjoy, well, let's call it the sunny side of life, to sit under their own vine and fig tree in the security and comfort of their own unadulterated abode and every single extension of it. And here's the final beautiful truth that binds the 18th century to the world in which we live today. The battles we fight on the digital frontier, the fight against the smart home wiretaps or the roadside flock cameras and the bureaucratic overreach into our private vehicles, are not just battles over data or privacy settings. They are the modern continuation of the exact same struggle that took place on the cobblestones of Boston. We're still defending the perimeter of our happiness. We protect our data because we are protecting our peace. We fight the kill switch because we are defending our autonomy. We demand that the state halt at our property line because we know that true liberty is found in the quiet, unmonitored moments of everyday life, in the laughter of our children, the safety of our sleep, and the freedom of the open road. Those 32 words James Madison left behind were never meant to be an historical relic. They were meant to be a permanent, ironclad guarantee that the king's shadow would never block the American sun, nor the sunny side of anyone's life.
When the shadows fall and doubts begin to creep, remember together we're strong, never weak. Lift your neighbor up with kindness every day. Let your actions speak the words you want to say.
The Sunny Side of Life is a weekly production about our life on the family farmstead here in Iowa, the liberties we prize, and the pursuits which make us happy. None of this is possible, of course, without Christ in our lives. For the Lord God is our sun and our shield. He gives us grace and glory.
Be the sunny side of someone else's life. Share your light and joy through struggle and strife. Keep your heart open and your soul always bright. Together we will share this sunny side life. Be the sunny side of someone else's life. Share your light and joy through struggle and strife. Keep your heart open and your soul always bright. Together we will share this sunny side life.
May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may the sunny side of your life in Christ be made evident unto you each and every day, and give you peace.